The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Cedar Ridge, a small frontier town nestled between jagged mountains and endless stretches of parched grassland. It was August of 1889, and the heat shimmered off the wooden buildings like water on hot iron. Eleanor May Whitfield stepped down from the stagecoach, her Eastern dress already coated with a fine layer of dust that seemed to permeate everything in this harsh land. At 22, Eleanor possessed the kind of delicate beauty that belonged in Boston drawing rooms, not in this rough-hewn settlement where tumbleweeds rolled past saloons and the air tasted of alkali and leather. Her auburn hair, pinned beneath a modest bonnet, caught glints of gold in the fading light. She clutched a small valise containing all her worldly possessions, her gloved hands trembling despite the oppressive heat. "Miss Whitfield?" a gruff voice called out. She turned to see a man approaching, tall, broad-shouldered, with features carved from granite and eyes the color of cold steel. This was Samuel Blackwood, the man she was to marry. He was 45, more than twice her age, with premature gray streaking his black beard. His clothes spoke of wealth, fine leather boots, a silver-studded belt, a hat that cost more than most men earned in a month. "Mr. Blackwood," she replied, forcing a smile she didn't feel. Her father's debts had sealed her fate. The family's shipping business in Philadelphia had collapsed, and Blackwood had offered to pay everything in exchange for her hand. It was a business transaction dressed up as marriage, and everyone knew it. "You're prettier than your photograph," he said, circling her like a rancher appraising livestock. "Good. A man needs something pleasant to look at after a hard day's work." The ride to the Blackwood Ranch took them through miles of desolate beauty. Sagebrush dotted the landscape, and in the distance the mountains rose like ancient sentinels. Eleanor had never seen such vast emptiness, such unforgiving terrain. Back east, there were always trees, always green, always the comforting press of civilization. Here, the land seemed to swallow everything, reducing humans to insignificant specks. The ranch house appeared as darkness fell, a sprawling structure of logs and stone, surrounded by corrals and outbuildings. Ranch hands moved about their evening chores, but they kept their eyes downcast as the wagon approached. Eleanor noticed how they scattered like frightened rabbits when Blackwood's shadow fell across their path. "Welcome to your new home, Mrs. Blackwood," Samuel said, though they wouldn't be married until tomorrow. The presumption in his voice made her skin crawl. That first night, Eleanor lay in the guest room. Tomorrow it would be their marriage bed, and listened to the unfamiliar sounds of the West. Coyotes howled in the distance, and the wind moaned through the gaps in the logs. But it was the sounds from downstairs that made her blood run cold. She heard shouting, the crash of furniture, and then a sharp crack that could only be a whip. A man's voice pleaded in Spanish, begging for mercy. Blackwood's laugh rang out, harsh and cruel. "You think you can steal from me, Miguel?" Another crack. "I own everything on this land, every blade of grass, every drop of water, every man who works for me." Eleanor crept to the top of the stairs, peering down into the main room. Blackwood stood over a young ranch hand who cowered on the floor, blood seeping through his shirt. The other workers watched, their faces masks of suppressed rage and fear. "Let this be a lesson to all of you," Blackwood announced, taking a long pull from a whiskey bottle. "Cross me, and you'll wish you'd never been born." He kicked the injured man once more for good measure, then stumbled toward the stairs. Eleanor fled back to her room, her heart pounding. She pressed a chair against the door and huddled in bed, pulling the covers to her chin. The wedding ceremony the next day was a grim affair. The traveling preacher spoke the words quickly, eager to collect his fee and leave. Eleanor wore her mother's dress, altered to fit, while Blackwood reeked of last night's whiskey. The few townspeople who attended seemed more interested in the free food than celebrating the union. "You may kiss your bride," the preacher intoned. Blackwood's kiss was possessive, his hands gripping her arms hard enough to leave marks. "Mine now," he whispered against her lips. and Eleanor tasted ashes and defeat. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of mounting dread. Blackwood's true nature revealed itself piece by piece. He controlled every aspect of her life. What she wore, what she ate, who she could speak to. The ranch hands weren't allowed to look at her directly. The Mexican women who worked in the house whispered prayers when they thought she couldn't hear. He drank heavily each night, and his temper grew worse with each bottle. Eleanor learned to recognize the signs, the slight slur in his speech, the way his eyes narrowed to slits, the restless pacing that preceded violence. She became expert at making herself small, at disappearing into corners and shadows. 3 weeks into their marriage, the storm came. Not just the thunderstorm that rolled across the plains with terrible fury, but the storm of Blackwood's rage. He'd lost a poker game in town, lost badly to men he considered beneath him. He came home with thunder in his eyes and lightning in his fists. "Where's my good luck charm?" he bellowed, searching the house for Eleanor. She tried to hide in the pantry, but he found her, dragging her out by her hair. "You're supposed to bring me luck," he snarled. "What good is a wife who can't even do that?" He dragged her to his study, where a fire blazed in the hearth despite the summer heat. Eleanor's eyes widened as she saw what lay on his desk. A branding iron, the kind used for marking cattle, glowing red-hot from the fire. "Please, Samuel, no!" "You need to understand something," he said, his voice deadly calm now, which was somehow worse than the yelling. "You're not Eleanor anymore. You're property, my property, and I mark what's mine." The pain was beyond description. The smell of burning flesh filled the room as he pressed the iron to her wrist, searing his brand into her pale skin. Eleanor's screams mingled with the crash of thunder outside. Through her tears, she saw him smiling. "There," he said, admiring his handiwork. "Now everyone will know. You're bound and branded. Little bird, try to fly away, and see what happens." Eleanor collapsed to the floor, cradling her burned wrist. The brand was small but deep, his initials, S.B., forever scarred into her flesh. As Blackwood staggered off to drink himself into unconsciousness, Eleanor remained on the study floor, rain lashing against the windows. In that moment, something crystallized within her. The fear remained, but alongside it grew something else, determination. She would not die here. She would not become another ghost haunting this ranch. As lightning illuminated the mountains beyond the windows, Eleanor began to plan. She would run, no matter the cost. Death in the wilderness seemed preferable to this slow suffocation. The storm raged on, but in Eleanor's heart, the first seeds of escape had been planted. She touched the angry burn on her wrist and made a silent vow. She would be free, or she would die trying. There was no other choice left to her now. The weeks following that terrible night passed like shadows across the desert floor. Eleanor moved through her days with careful precision, playing the role of the subdued wife while her mind worked tirelessly on escape. The burn on her wrist had scarred over, leaving raised letters that caught the lamplight, a constant reminder of what she had become in Samuel Blackwood's eyes. Property. She began her preparations with the patience of a spider spinning its web. A heel of bread here, wrapped in cloth and hidden beneath loose floorboards in the pantry. A handful of dried beans there, secreted away in an old flour sack. When Maria, the eldest of the Mexican housekeepers, wasn't looking, Eleanor would slip jerky into her apron pockets. The woman noticed. Eleanor was certain of it, but Maria's dark eyes held only pity and a quiet understanding. The map was her greatest prize. She'd found it in Blackwood's study while dusting. An old surveyor's chart of the territory showing trails, water sources, and settlements. Her hands had trembled as she traced the thin lines that led away from the ranch, through the mountains toward freedom. She couldn't take the original, but over several weeks, she painstakingly copied it onto a piece of brown paper, working by candlelight in the early morning hours before the household stirred. Eleanor learned the rhythms of the ranch like a condemned woman memorizing her prison. Blackwood rode out most mornings to oversee the cattle operations, returning by afternoon. Tuesday nights he played cards in town, often not returning until dawn. The ranch hands changed shifts at specific times, leaving brief windows when certain areas went unwatched. She noted it all, building her plan piece by piece. The mountains called to her from her bedroom window. She could see them rising like a promised land, their peaks catching the first and last light of each day. Somewhere beyond those granite walls lay towns where no one knew her name, where she could disappear and start anew. She'd heard the ranch hands speak of mining camps and settlements on the other side, rough places, but places where a woman might find work and anonymity. She chose a Tuesday in late September. The autumn winds had begun to blow, carrying the scent of coming winter, but the snow hadn't yet made the mountain passes impassable. Blackwood had been drinking heavily the night before, celebrating some cattle sale, and would likely spend the morning nursing his head before riding to town for cards. That morning dawned gray and still, with clouds hanging low over the mountains like a shroud. Eleanor forced herself through the morning routine, serving Blackwood his breakfast, enduring his casual cruelties with downcast eyes. He grabbed her scarred wrist as she poured his coffee, squeezing until she gasped. "Remember what you are," he said softly, then released her to return to his eggs. After he left for town, Eleanor moved swiftly. She dressed in her darkest, most practical dress and sturdy boots she'd found in a trunk in the attic, likely belonging to Blackwood's late first wife, about whom no one spoke. She wrapped her meager supplies in a blanket, tied it with rope, and slipped out the back door as the housekeepers prepared lunch. The stables were her first obstacle. Jake Morrison, the head groom, was a decent man trapped by circumstances like everyone else on the ranch. Eleanor had watched him tend the horses with gentle hands, speaking to them in low, soothing tones. She found him mucking out stalls, his back turned, moving silently. She approached a small bay mare named Sage. Not the finest horse, but steady and sure-footed. Eleanor had smuggled apples to her over the weeks, earning the animal's trust. She'd already identified the tack she needed, hanging on the wall nearby. Her hands shook as she saddled the mare, every small sound seeming loud as thunder, just as she tightened the cinch. Jake turned around. Their eyes met across the dusty space. Eleanor's heart stopped. This was it. He would shout for help, raise the alarm, and her chance would be gone forever. But Jake simply looked at her, at the desperate determination in her eyes, at the supplies tied to the saddle. His gaze flickered to her wrist, where the edge of the scar showed beneath her sleeve. Then, deliberately, he turned his back again and resumed mucking the stall, whistling tunelessly. "Best hurry," he said quietly, not looking at her. "Storm's coming in from the north. You'll want to reach cover before it hits." Eleanor's throat tightened with gratitude. She led Sage out the back of the stable, mounted awkwardly. She'd had few chances to ride since arriving, and urged the mare into a walk, then a trot, then finally a gallop as they cleared the ranch boundaries. The land opened before her, vast and terrifying in its emptiness. She'd studied the map until she could see it with her eyes closed, follow the dry creek bed north, turn west at the split rock that looked like an eagle's head, find the old Indian trail that wound up into the foothills. But maps were one thing. The reality of the terrain was another. An hour into her flight, the promised storm arrived with vengeance. The wind rose from a whisper to a howl, picking up dust and sand, flinging it with stinging force. Eleanor pulled her shawl over her face, squinting through the brown haze, trying to keep her bearings. Sage struggled against the wind, head down, legs churning. The visibility dropped to mere yards. Eleanor could no longer see the mountains that were her guide. The creek bed she'd been following vanished in the swirling dust. Panic clawed at her throat. She was lost, turned around in the storm with no idea which direction led to freedom and which led back to hell. Then she heard it, the sound that made her blood turn to ice. Hoofbeats, multiple horses, riding hard despite the storm. They were coming for her. Blackwood must have returned early, discovered her gone, and sent his men in pursuit. Or perhaps he led them himself, driven by rage at her defiance. Eleanor kicked Sage harder, urging the mare off what might have been the trail and into the maze of rocks and scrub brush. The wind howled louder, but not loud enough to completely mask the shouts of men calling to each other, coordinating their search. She drove Sage up a steep slope, stones clattering beneath the mare's hooves. At the crest, she paused, looking back through the dust. Dark shapes moved below, riders spread out in a search line, methodically covering ground. One of them had dogs. She could hear their baying even over the storm. Desperation lent her strength. She turned Sage toward the darkening smudge that must be the forest line and gave the mare her head. They plunged down the far side of the ridge, half sliding on the loose shale. Behind them, a shout went up. They'd been spotted. The trees, when they finally reached them, provided blessed relief from the worst of the wind. But Eleanor was exhausted, and Sage was laboring. Foam flecking her chest, they crashed through underbrush, branches tearing at Eleanor's dress and hair. The sounds of pursuit grew closer. A ravine opened suddenly before them. Sage skidded to a stop, nearly throwing Eleanor from the saddle. It was too wide to jump, too steep to descend. Trapped, Eleanor could hear the dogs clearly now, their excited barking drawing nearer. She dismounted and slapped Sage's rump, sending the mare crashing away through the brush. Maybe it would draw off some of the pursuers. Then she scrambled along the edge of the ravine, looking for any way down. Her hands were bleeding from thorns, her breath coming in desperate gasps. There, a deer trail, barely visible, switchbacking down the cliff face. Without hesitation, Eleanor began to descend. Loose rocks gave way beneath her feet. She fell, sliding, her dress catching and tearing on exposed roots. Above, she heard horses arriving at the spot where she'd left Sage. "The horse is here," a man shouted. "She can't be far." Eleanor pressed herself against the cliff face, praying the gathering darkness would hide her. Her ankle throbbed. She twisted it in the fall, but she couldn't stop. Freedom or death. There was no middle ground now. She continued down, inch by painful inch, as night fell like a curtain around her. The storm was passing, leaving an eerie quiet broken only by the distant shouts of her pursuers and the sound of her own ragged breathing. At the bottom of the ravine, a small stream gurgled over stones. Eleanor stumbled into it, hoping the water would throw off the dog's scent. She followed the stream in the darkness, one hand on the ravine wall for guidance, the other clutching her side where pain bloomed from a deep scratch. Time lost meaning. There was only the next step, the next breath, the desperate need to keep moving. When her strength finally gave out, when her legs simply refused to carry her another step, Eleanor collapsed beside the stream. The stars were visible now through the canyon overhead, cold and distant as Blackwood's eyes. She had no idea how far she'd come or where she was. Her supplies were gone with Sage. She was injured, lost, and alone in the wilderness. But she was not branded property, hiding in shadows anymore. As Eleanor lay there beside the mountain stream, feeling the cold seep into her bones, she managed a small, fierce smile. She had done it. She had run. Whatever came next, death by exposure, wild animals, or recapture, she had proven that his brand did not define her. Her heart remained her own. The sound of pursuit had faded, but Eleanor knew they would resume the search at first light. She needed to move, to find better shelter, but her body refused to cooperate. As unconsciousness crept over her like a dark tide, her last coherent thought was a prayer to any power that might be listening. Let me wake to freedom, or let me not wake at all. The first sensation was coolness against her burning forehead. Eleanor's eyes fluttered open to find herself staring at rough wooden beams overhead. Firelight danced across them, casting shifting shadows. She wasn't by the stream anymore. Panic seized her. Had Blackwood's men found her? She tried to sit up, but the world spun violently. "Easy." The voice was deep, quiet as distant thunder. A man sat in the shadows beyond the fire's reach, working on something with his hands. Eleanor could make out his silhouette. Tall, broad-shouldered, still as carved stone except for the small movements of his task. "Who?" Her voice came out as a croak. Her throat felt like sand. Without speaking, He rose and moved into the light. Eleanor's breath caught. He was perhaps 35, with dark hair that fell past his collar and a full beard that hadn't seen a barber in months. His clothes were practical: buckskin shirt, worn pants, boots that had walked many miles. But it was his eyes that held her attention, gray as winter sky. They regarded her with an intensity that was neither threatening nor warm, simply observant. He handed her a tin cup of water. Eleanor drank greedily, her hands shaking. As she lowered the cup, she noticed her ankle had been wrapped, her various cuts cleaned and bandaged. Someone had tended her injuries with surprising skill. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded once and returned to his spot by the fire. She could see now what occupied his hands. He was fletching arrows, each movement precise and practiced. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the crack of burning wood and the distant call of an owl. Eleanor studied her surroundings. The cabin was small but well built, with tools hanging neatly on the walls and furs stacked in one corner. No decorations, no personal touches save for a rifle propped near the door and what looked like trap lines coiled on pegs. This was a functional space, built for survival, not comfort. "How long?" she managed. 2 days. His voice had an unused quality, as if he spoke rarely. "Fever broke this morning. 2 days. Blackwood would have search parties everywhere by now." Eleanor instinctively pulled the blanket higher, though she noticed she still wore her torn dress. This man, whoever he was, had maintained her modesty while caring for her injuries. "I need to go," she said, attempting to swing her legs off the narrow cot. The room tilted alarmingly. "Storm coming," he said without looking up from his work. 3, maybe 4 days. Eleanor wanted to argue, but through the single window, she could see dark clouds massing over the peaks. The temperature had dropped even in the short time she'd been awake. She was trapped again. But somehow this felt different from the ranch. There was no malice here, just matter-of-fact statement of conditions. "What's your name?" she asked. He was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Jeremiah Hunt. Some call me the Silent Hunter." A ghost of something, perhaps irony, touched his lips. "Don't much care for it." Eleanor recognized the name. She'd heard it whispered in Cedar Ridge, always with a mixture of respect and unease. He was the one who brought in pelts no other trapper could find, who vanished into the mountains for months at a time. Some said he'd gone wild, forgotten how to live among people. Others claimed he was hiding from something, or someone. "I'm Eleanor," she said, then caught herself. What good would lies do now? Eleanor Blackwood. His hands stilled for just a moment, then resumed their work. He knew the name. Then, everyone in 3 counties knew Samuel Blackwood. "He'll come looking," she said quietly. "I'm sorry. I've brought trouble to your door." Jeremiah set down the arrow and looked at her directly. His gaze traveled to her bandaged wrist, where the edge of the brand showed. Something shifted in those gray eyes. Not pity, which she would have hated, but understanding. "Let him come," he said simply, and returned to his work. Eleanor dozed fitfully through the day, waking to find bowls of simple stew and more water within reach. Jeremiah moved about the cabin with an economy of motion, everything deliberate and necessary. He checked trap lines near the cabin, brought in firewood, skinned a rabbit with quick efficiency. He never spoke unless necessary, but his silence wasn't oppressive like Blackwood's sullen moods. It was simply his natural state. By evening, she felt strong enough to sit up properly. The storm Jeremiah had predicted was moving in, wind rattling the cabin's sturdy walls. He secured the shutters and built up the fire, preparing for a long blow. "How did you find me?" Eleanor asked as he settled back into his chair. "Wasn't looking to find anyone," he replied, following deer sign down the canyon. "Heard something that wasn't animal movement." He paused. "Considering, you were talking feverish." Eleanor's cheeks burned. "What did I say?" "Nothing that matters now." She suspected that wasn't entirely true, but didn't press. Instead, she watched him work on a new arrow, noting the careful precision of each motion. His hands were scarred, old marks that spoke of hard living and harder choices. "You live here alone," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "Yes, by choice." He looked up at her then, and she saw something flicker in his eyes. Old pain, carefully controlled. Only way I know anymore. The storm hit that night with full fury. Snow driven by howling wind piled against the walls, and the temperature plummeted. Jeremiah kept the fire burning high, but still Eleanor shivered on her cot. Without comment, he pulled down several thick furs and laid them over her blanket. The warmth was immediate and welcome. "Bear," he said at her questioning look. "Grizzly. Took him 2 winters back when he tried to claim this cabin." Eleanor traced the thick fur with one finger, imagining the courage it took to face such a creature. Everything here spoke of competence, of a man who had made peace with the harsh realities of mountain living. It was so different from Blackwood's swagger and need to dominate. Jeremiah dominated nothing. He simply existed in harmony with his surroundings. On the second night of the storm, Eleanor's nightmares found her. She was back in Blackwood's study, the brand glowing red, his laughter echoing off the walls. She woke gasping, sweat-soaked despite the cold. Jeremiah was there, not touching, just present. He'd moved his chair closer to her cot. "Just a dream," he said quietly. "It wasn't," she whispered. "It happened." He nodded slowly. "I know. But it's done now. You're here." Something in his tone made her look at him more closely. In the firelight, she could see lines carved by weather and hardship, but also something else, a steadiness, a man who had faced his own demons and found a way to live with them. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. "You don't know me. I could bring you nothing but trouble." Jeremiah was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "Was tracking through Miller's Pass 8 years back," he finally said. "Found a girl. Couldn't have been more than 16. Running from something. Someone." His jaw tightened. "Got her to safety. But I was too late. The damage was done. She didn't last the week." Eleanor understood then. This wasn't charity or attraction. It was atonement. He was saving her because he hadn't been able to save another. She wanted to tell him it wasn't his fault, but she recognized the futility. Some guilt you carried forever, like brands on your soul. The storm raged for 3 more days. In that time, Eleanor learned the rhythms of the cabin. She helped with small tasks as her strength returned, mending tears in clothing, preparing simple meals from his stores, keeping the fire fed. They developed a companionable routine with minimal words. Jeremiah taught her to read weather sign, to identify tracks in the snow during brief lulls in the storm. She told him about Philadelphia, about the life she'd left behind, everything but the circumstances that had driven her west. On the morning the storm cleared, Eleanor stood at the window watching sunrise paint the peaks gold and rose. The world outside was transformed, buried under feet of pristine snow, beautiful and terrible. "I have to keep going," she said without turning. "He won't stop looking." "Where?" She touched the copied map in her pocket, miraculously still there after everything. "There's a mining camp over the western passes. Silver Creek. I could find work there, disappear. Those passes are closed now." Jeremiah said, "Won't be clear until spring." Eleanor's heart sank. Trapped again, but for months this time. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass, fighting despair. "There's another way," he said slowly, as if the words were pulled from him. "North through Devil's Canyon, then west along the high ridges. Harder route, dangerous, but passable if you know the markers." She turned to look at him. "Do you know the markers?" He met her gaze steadily. "I do." The implication hung between them. He was offering to guide her, to leave his solitary existence and take her through treacherous terrain with winter closing in. It was an enormous thing to ask, though she hadn't asked it. "Why?" she whispered. Jeremiah stood and moved to the window, looking out at the pristine wilderness he'd made his home. Man needs a reason to keep going. he said quietly. Been a long time since I had one. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, the first she'd allowed herself since fleeing the ranch. This strange, silent man was offering her more than guide service. He was offering hope. When? She asked. Rest another day. Gather supplies. Leave at first light day after tomorrow. He glanced at her ankle. If you're able. I'll be able, Eleanor said fiercely. She'd crawl over those mountains if necessary. That night, as she lay under the bearskin furs listening to the fire settle into embers, Eleanor reflected on the strange turns of fate. She'd run from one man's cruel possession only to find shelter with another man entirely. But Jeremiah asked nothing of her, expected nothing. His help came without strings or conditions. For the first time since leaving Philadelphia, she felt something she'd thought lost forever. Safety. The brand on her wrist still ached, would always be there. But it no longer defined her. In this simple cabin with its silent occupant, she was just Eleanor. Not property, not branded, not owned. Just a woman preparing for the next stage of her journey toward freedom. The mountain dawn broke crimson and gold across the peaks, painting the snow-covered ridges in shades of fire. Eleanor stood at the edge of the small clearing outside Jeremiah's cabin, breathing in air so cold it burned her lungs. 2 weeks had passed since her arrival, and her body had mended under his quiet care. The twisted ankle now bore her weight steadily. The various cuts had healed to pink lines, and the fever was a distant memory. She watched Jeremiah move through his morning routine with practiced efficiency. He checked his trap lines, each movement deliberate and sure despite the knee-deep snow. A rabbit hung from his belt, breakfast and dinner for the day. The economy of his existence fascinated her. Nothing wasted, every action purposeful. Storm cleared the lower valley, he said, returning to where she waited. His breath clouded in the frigid air. Saw tracks. Riders passed through yesterday, heading south. Eleanor's hand instinctively went to her scarred wrist. Blackwood's men. Still searching. The net was wide, but winter was forcing them to contract their search. Soon the high passes would be their only option for escape. Inside the cabin, she helped prepare the rabbit while Jeremiah melted snow for water. They had developed an easy rhythm, working in companionable silence. She had learned to read his minimal expressions, the slight tightening around his eyes when storm weather approached, the almost imperceptible nod when she did something correctly, the way he unconsciously positioned himself between her and the door whenever they heard unexpected sounds outside. "Teach me," she said suddenly as he began skinning the rabbit. He paused, then handed her the knife. His hands covered hers, guiding the blade. "Like this, steady pressure. Let the edge do the work." Eleanor focused on the task, aware of his proximity but not threatened by it. His touch was impersonal, instructive, so different from Blackwood's possessive hands. Under Jeremiah's patient guidance, she managed to clean the rabbit adequately, if not expertly. "You learn quick," he observed, taking the carcass to prepare for the pot. "I had to," Eleanor replied softly. "Back there, being slow to learn meant—" She trailed off, unable to finish. Jeremiah nodded without turning. He understood. He always seemed to understand without her having to explain. That afternoon, he began teaching her survival skills in earnest. How to read weather patterns in the clouds and wind, the difference between old snow that would hold weight and new snow that would give way treacherously. How to find water when streams were frozen. How to build a shelter from pine boughs if caught in the open. "Why are you teaching me all this?" Eleanor asked as they practiced building a fire with damp wood. "You'll be with me on the journey." "Mountains don't forgive assumptions," he replied. "Best you know how to survive alone." The thought chilled her more than the wind. She had grown accustomed to his steady presence, the safety of the cabin. The idea of facing the wilderness alone again brought back the terror of her flight from the ranch. "Here," Jeremiah said, producing something from his pack. "Made this for you." It was a knife in a leather sheath, the blade sharp and well-balanced. The handle was antler, carved with simple but elegant patterns. Hours of work had gone into it. "I can't," Eleanor breathed. You will, he said simply, attaching the sheath to her belt. Tool, not weapon, but serves as both if needed. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Eleanor found herself studying him in the flickering light. The angles of his face were harsh, weathered by wind and sun. But there was something gentle in the way he moved, the care he took with small tasks. She wondered what had driven him to this solitary life. What ghost haunted his past? You mentioned Miller's Pass, she said carefully. The girl you found. His hand stilled on the trap he was mending. For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Sarah, he said finally. Sarah Brennan, daughter of a farming family down in the valley. Good people. His voice carried old pain. She'd been taken by raiders passing through. By the time she escaped, and I found her. He shook his head. Some wounds go too deep. It wasn't your fault. I know that here. He touched his head. Not so much here. He placed a hand over his heart. Eleanor understood. The brand on her wrist might fade with time, but the deeper marks, those never fully healed. Is that why you live alone? Punishment. Jeremiah looked at her then. Really looked at her. Started that way. Now. He gestured around the cabin. Just life. What I know. Don't you get lonely? Didn't used to notice. He admitted. Trees and mountains don't judge. Don't ask questions. Don't need anything but respect. He paused. Been different lately. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks and looked away. These past weeks had been different for her too. The constant fear that had been her companion for months was fading, replaced by something else. Not attraction. She wasn't ready for that. Might never be. But connection. Understanding. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell. Outside, a wolf howled in the distance, answered by another. The sound that would have terrified her weeks ago now seemed merely part of the mountain's nightly song. Eleanor found herself telling him about her life before Blackwood, the shipping business, her father's gradual slide into debt and drink, her mother's death from consumption when Eleanor was 15, the suitors who came calling, seeing only her beauty and her father's former status, not the girl who loved books and music and dreams of traveling the world. Then Blackwood's offer came, she said quietly. Father presented it as salvation. Marry this successful rancher, save the family name. I was merchandise in a business transaction. You were surviving, Jeremiah corrected. No shame in that. I thought I could endure it, Eleanor continued. I'd heard frontier men could be rough but fair. I thought, she laughed bitterly. I was naive. You were hopeful, he said. Different thing. She showed him the brand then, fully revealing what she'd kept partially hidden. In the firelight, the raised scars formed SB, clearly. Jeremiah studied it without touching, his face unreadable. He said I was bound and branded. Eleanor whispered, like his cattle, his property forever. He was wrong, Jeremiah said quietly. Man can put a mark on skin, can't brand a soul unless you let him. Tears slipped down Eleanor's cheeks. Tears she'd held back for so long, not of sadness, but of relief. Someone understood. Someone saw her as more than damaged goods. The next morning brought troubling news. Jeremiah returned from checking his furthest trap line with a grim expression. Riders in the North Valley, 6, maybe 7, making camp at the old trading post. Eleanor's heart sank. The trading post was strategic. It commanded views of several mountain approaches. They were establishing a base for extended searching. They're not giving up, she said. No, Jeremiah agreed. He won't. Men like that can't stand losing what they think they own. Maybe I should just... No. His voice was sharp, the most emotion she'd heard from him. You don't go back, not to that. Eleanor was surprised by his vehemence. It might be safer for you if... Safety's not everything, he interrupted. Sometimes the right thing costs, worth paying. That afternoon, he altered their plans. The direct route through Devil's Canyon was now too risky with searchers so close. They would need to go higher, through passes rarely used even in summer. It would add days to the journey and significantly increase the danger. "Can we make it?" Eleanor asked, studying the marks he'd made on her map. "Maybe," he said honestly. "Depends on weather, luck, and will." He looked at her. "You got 2 of those for certain." Eleanor felt a fierce determination rise in her. She'd come too far to fail now. "When do we leave?" "Soon. 2 days, maybe 3. Need to prepare more supplies for the longer route." That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She stood by the window watching clouds race across the moon, thinking about the journey ahead. Jeremiah joined her, moving so quietly she didn't hear him until he spoke. "Scared?" "Terrified," she admitted. "But more scared of staying, of being caught, of going back to that life." "Fear's useful," he said. "Keeps you sharp. Just can't let it rule you." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the night. Eleanor was acutely aware of his presence, the solid strength of him. Not threatening, just there, steady as the mountains themselves. "Jeremiah," she said softly, "after we reach Silver Creek, what will you do?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Come back here, I suppose. What I know." Something in his tone made her chest tighten. These weeks had changed things for both of them, created a connection neither had expected. The thought of him returning to his solitary existence while she disappeared into a mining camp seemed suddenly wrong. "You could stay," she said impulsively. "In Silver Creek. I mean, start fresh. Towns and I don't mix well anymore." He said, "Too many people. Too much noise." Eleanor nodded, understanding but saddened. They were from different worlds, brought together by chance and necessity. Once she was safe, that necessity would end. "I'll miss this," she said quietly, gesturing at the peaceful cabin, the mountains beyond. "Miss the quiet, the simplicity." "You'll find your way," Jeremiah said. "You're stronger than you know." Eleanor touched the knife at her belt, thinking of all he'd taught her. Not just survival skills, but something deeper. How to be alone without being lonely. How to find strength in silence. How to heal without forgetting. "Thank you," she said, putting all her gratitude into those simple words. He nodded, understanding this too. Tomorrow they would begin final preparations. Soon after, they would set out into the frozen wilderness, pursued by dangerous men, facing brutal conditions. But tonight, they stood together in peaceful companionship. 2 damaged souls who had found an unexpected harbor in each other. The mountains waited, patient and eternal. And somewhere beyond them, freedom called to Eleanor with a voice stronger than fear, stronger than the brand on her wrist, stronger than the chains of her past. She was ready to answer. The morning of their departure arrived wrapped in an ominous stillness. No wind stirred the pine branches. No birds called from the forest. Even the ever-present whisper of the mountain seemed to hold its breath. Eleanor stood outside the cabin, her breath misting in the pre-dawn darkness, every sense alert to the unnatural quiet. "Weather's turning," Jeremiah said, emerging with the last of their supplies. His face was grave as he studied the sky. "Feels like a big one building." They had packed carefully. Dried meat, hardtack, coffee, ammunition for his rifle, blankets, rope, and the precious medical supplies he insisted on bringing. Eleanor wore layers of clothing, some her own, some adapted from what Jeremiah could spare. The knife he'd made for her sat reassuringly at her belt. "Should we wait?" she asked, though every instinct screamed against delay. "No." He adjusted the pack on her shoulders, checking the straps. "Waiting gives them more time to close the net. We go now. We might slip through before the storm hits." They set out as the first pale light touched the eastern peaks. Jeremiah led, breaking trail through the snow, his movements economical and sure. Eleanor followed in his footsteps, finding it easier to match his stride than forge her own path. Behind them, the cabin disappeared into the forest, swallowed by trees and shadow. The first hours passed in relative ease. They climbed steadily, following game trails and old paths Jeremiah knew by heart. He pointed out landmarks, a lightning-struck pine, a distinctive rock formation, a frozen waterfall, teaching her to navigate even as they fled. Eleanor's legs burned with effort, but she pushed forward, driven by the knowledge that each step took her further from Blackwood's reach. By midday, they had reached the first challenge, a steep traverse across an exposed mountainside. The snow here was wind-scoured and unstable, ready to slide at the slightest provocation. Jeremiah studied the slope with the intensity of a man reading scripture. "Stay exactly in my steps," he instructed. "If it starts to go, drop flat and dig in with anything you've got." Eleanor's heart pounded as they began the crossing. The mountainside fell away below them, a dizzying drop to jagged rocks. Each footstep had to be perfect, weight distributed carefully. Halfway across, she heard it, a soft rumble from above. "Move!" Jeremiah shouted. They ran, abandoning caution for speed. The rumble grew to a roar as the snowpack above them released. Eleanor felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Jeremiah grabbed her arm, hauling her bodily the last few yards to solid ground as tons of snow thundered past where they'd been standing. They collapsed against a rock outcropping, gasping. Eleanor's legs shook uncontrollably. She'd faced Blackwood's rage, fled alone into the wilderness, but nothing had prepared her for the mountain's impersonal violence. "You did good," Jeremiah said, his hand still on her arm. "Quick thinking, quick feet. I almost got us killed," she gasped. "No, Mountain decided to test us. We passed." He helped her to her feet. "Come on, that slide will be visible for miles. If they're watching." They pushed harder, climbing through thickening forest as the day waned. The threatened storm was building. Eleanor could feel the pressure dropping, making her ears pop. Dark clouds massed over the peaks ahead, pregnant with snow. As darkness approached, Jeremiah led them to a small cave he knew, really just an overhang of rock with enough space to shelter 2 people. They couldn't risk a fire. The smoke would be a beacon to any searchers, so they huddled together for warmth, sharing cold rations and melted snow. "Tomorrow will be harder," he warned. "We'll hit the high passes. Air gets thin, cold like you've never felt." Eleanor nodded, too tired to speak. Every muscle ached, and she knew this was only the beginning. In the distance, a wolf howled, answered by its pack. The sound raised primitive fears, but Jeremiah seemed unconcerned. "They're hunting south of us," he said, "following the elk herds down. Won't bother with us unless we bother them first." They settled in for the night, pressed close for warmth. Eleanor had never been this physically intimate with a man who wasn't trying to possess her. Jeremiah's presence was purely practical, shared body heat for survival. Yet she found herself relaxing against him, feeling safer than she had in months. She dozed fitfully, waking once to find snow falling thick and fast beyond their shelter. Jeremiah was awake, rifle across his knees, keeping watch. "Sleep," he murmured. "Long day tomorrow." The storm hit in earnest as they broke camp. Wind-driven snow reduced visibility to mere yards, and the temperature plummeted. Eleanor pulled her scarf over her face, but ice still formed on her eyelashes and in her nostrils. Each breath was a struggle in the thin air. Jeremiah navigated by instinct and memory, leading them through a landscape transformed by the blizzard. What had been visible peaks and valleys was now a white void. Eleanor focused on his back, on placing one foot after another, on not giving in to the cold that tried to steal thought and will. Hours blurred together. Up and up they climbed, the trail growing steeper and more treacherous. Several times Eleanor slipped, saved only by Jeremiah's quick reflexes. Her world narrowed to the next step, the next breath, the next moment of survival. Then, through the howling wind, came a sound that froze her blood. Gunshots. 3 of them, spaced deliberately. A signal. Jeremiah pulled her behind a cluster of rocks. "They're below us," he said, having to shout over the wind. "Maybe a mile back. They're tracking us in this." Eleanor couldn't hide her dismay. "Blackwood must want you bad, Or want to make an example?" His face was grim. "Changes things. Can't stay ahead of them at this pace." "Leave me," Eleanor said. "You can move faster alone." "No." The word was final. "We go together or not at all." He led them off the main trail, plunging into a maze of rocks and stunted trees. The going was brutal, but it would be harder for horsemen to follow. Behind them, more gunshots echoed through the storm, closer now. They pushed through the day, not stopping for food or rest. Eleanor's strength was failing. The altitude, cold, and exhaustion combined to make each step agony. She stumbled more frequently, her reactions slowing. Jeremiah half-carried her the last 100 yards to another shelter, a shallow depression beneath an overhanging ledge. "Can't stop long," he said, forcing her to drink water and eat dried meat. "But you need rest, or you'll collapse." Eleanor huddled against him, shivering uncontrollably. Through the snow, she thought she saw shapes moving, dark figures against the white. Hunters or hallucinations? She couldn't tell anymore. "I'm slowing you down," she whispered. "You're doing fine," he said firmly. "Seen grown men quit with less reason. You're still moving, still fighting. That's what counts." He was lying. She knew. She was a liability now. But the set of his jaw told her arguing was pointless. He would not abandon her, no matter the cost to himself. The nobility of it made her chest tight with emotion she couldn't afford to feel. The storm began to break near sunset, revealing a transformed landscape. They had climbed higher than Eleanor realized. The world spread out below them in a sea of clouds and snow-covered peaks, beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. "There," Jeremiah pointed to a distant saddle between two peaks. "That's our pass. Make that by nightfall. We can drop down the other side. Be out of their reach by morning." It looked impossibly far. Eleanor's legs trembled just standing, but she nodded, drawing on reserves she didn't know she possessed. They had just begun the final ascent when disaster struck. The snow beneath Eleanor's feet gave way without warning. She fell, sliding down the steep slope, her desperate grabs finding no purchase on the icy surface. She heard Jeremiah shout, saw him diving after her. Then her head struck something hard and the world went dark. She woke to find herself in a different place, a small ice cave, barely large enough for two. Her head throbbed, and when she touched it, her hand came away bloody. Jeremiah knelt beside her, his face drawn with concern. "How bad?" she asked. "Concussion, maybe. Bleeding stopped." He'd used part of his shirt to bandage her head. "Lost some gear in the slide, including most of the food." Eleanor struggled to focus through the pain. "The pass? We're off course. Storms picked up again, and—" He hesitated. "I heard voices. They're closer than I thought, maybe half a mile." Terror cut through her confusion. After everything, to be caught now seemed unbearably cruel. "What do we do?" "Rest tonight. Move at first light." He settled beside her. "If they find us—" He touched his rifle. "I won't let them take you back. Promise you that." Eleanor understood what he wasn't saying. He would fight, kill if necessary, die if necessary. For her, a woman he'd known mere weeks. The weight of that sacrifice pressed on her heart. "Why?" she whispered. "Why does it matter so much?" He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind howled like a living thing. Man spends enough time alone. He figures out what matters, what doesn't. You matter. Eleanor, your freedom matters. Maybe saving you saves a piece of me too. She reached out, finding his hand in the darkness. Calloused, strong, gentle. "We'll make it," she said with conviction she didn't feel. "Both of us." They spent the night pressed together in the tiny cave, sharing what little warmth they had. Eleanor dozed fitfully, jarred awake by every sound. Once, she was certain she heard horses, men's voices carrying on the wind. But morning came without discovery. The final day dawned clear and bitter cold. Eleanor's head still pounded, and dark spots danced in her vision. But she forced herself upright. They had no choice but to move. Jeremiah broke trail through deep snow, each step a monumental effort at this altitude. Eleanor followed, stumbling, catching herself, pushing forward through sheer will. The pass loomed above them, so close yet seeming to recede with each painful step. Then, cutting through the thin air, came the sound they dreaded. Horses. Eleanor turned to see dark shapes emerging from the tree line below. 6 riders, maybe 7, spread out to cut off escape routes. "Run," Jeremiah said quietly, then louder, urgently. "Run!" They fled up the final slope, lungs burning in the thin air. Eleanor's vision tunneled, black creeping in at the edges. Behind them, shouts echoed off the peaks. A rifle cracked, the bullet whining off nearby rocks. The pass, just ahead, 20 yards. 10. Eleanor's legs gave out. She fell, tried to rise, fell again. The world spun sickeningly. Strong arms lifted her, Jeremiah carrying her the last impossible steps. They crested the pass as more shots rang out, plunging down the far side into a different world. Steep, treacherous, but leading away from pursuit. They half ran, half fell down the mountain's western face, using controlled slides where they could, scrambling over rocks where they couldn't. The riders would have to abandon their horses to follow. It bought them time, but not much. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, painting the snow blood red, they finally stopped. Far below, the lights of Silver Creek twinkled like fallen stars. They had made it, almost. Eleanor collapsed in the snow, every reserve depleted. Jeremiah knelt beside her, his own exhaustion evident in the slump of his shoulders. They had pushed beyond human limits and somehow survived. "Thank you," Eleanor whispered, the words pathetically inadequate. He helped her to her feet one more time. "Not done yet. Few more miles. Then you're free." They began the final descent toward the mining camp and Eleanor's new life. Behind them, the mountains stood witness to their flight, keeping their secrets in ice and stone. Whatever came next, she had proven something to herself and the world. She was nobody's property. The brand on her wrist remained, but her spirit had broken free, carried on the wings of a silent hunter's courage and her own indomitable will. The mountains had tested them both and found them worthy. Freedom waited below, uncertain but real, bought with blood and struggle and the kindness of a man who asked for nothing but gave everything. Eleanor took Jeremiah's offered hand, and together they walked toward the lights of Silver Creek, toward hope, toward a future unbranded and unbound. The cave was little more than a hollow in the mountainside, but after days of flight through blizzard and gunfire, it felt like sanctuary. They had found it as the last light faded from the sky, tucked behind a frozen waterfall that concealed its entrance. Jeremiah built a small fire far back from the opening, the smoke dispersing through cracks in the ceiling. For the first time in days, Eleanor felt truly warm. She sat close to the flames, watching shadows dance across Jeremiah's face as he tended her injuries. The gash on her head had reopened during their descent, and he cleaned it with melted snow and the last of their medical supplies. His touch was gentle but efficient, the careful hands of someone who had mended many wounds, including his own. "You should have been a doctor," Eleanor said softly. "Thought about it once," he replied, tying off the bandage. "Long time ago, different life." The cave was small enough that they sat shoulder to shoulder, sharing the warmth of the fire and each other. Outside, snow began to fall again, but gently this time, without the storm's earlier violence. They were less than a day's journey from Silver Creek now, but exhaustion had forced this final rest. "Tell me," Eleanor said quietly, "about before. Who were you before the mountains?" Jeremiah was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. He fed another stick to the fire, watching it catch and burn. "Thomas Jeremiah Hunt," he said finally. "Had a different name for the middle then. James, my father's name." His voice carried old pain. "Was married, had a small ranch down in the valley, cattle, some horses, good land." Eleanor waited, sensing the weight of what was coming. "Elizabeth was her name. Beth." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Met her at a church social. She was the schoolteacher's daughter, too good for a rough rancher. But she chose me anyway. We had 2 years, 2 good years. The fire popped, sending sparks spiraling upward. Then the sickness came. Cholera, they think, took half the valley that summer. I was out with the herd when it hit worst. By the time I got back, he shook his head. Lost her. Lost the baby she was carrying. Lost everything that mattered. Eleanor's throat tightened. She understood now. The isolation, the self-imposed exile. I'm sorry. After that, couldn't stay. Sold the land, went to the mountains. Figured if I couldn't save the one person who mattered most, least I could do was not matter to anyone again. He looked at her then. Been living that way 8 years. Until you. The weight of his confession hung between them. Eleanor felt the responsibility of it. She had pulled him back into the world, into caring, into risk. I never meant to. I know. He cut her off gently. You didn't ask for any of this. But maybe it was time. Man can't hide from life forever, no matter how high he climbs. Eleanor found herself telling him then about the nights after the branding, the dark thoughts that had whispered seductively of ending the pain permanently. How she'd stood at the ranch house's highest window, calculating the drop, only to be stopped by stubbornness more than hope. She couldn't let Blackwood win that completely. That's strength, Jeremiah said, not giving him that power. It didn't feel strong. It felt like spite. Sometimes they're the same thing. They talked through the night, sharing stories they'd never told another soul. Eleanor spoke of her mother's death, how she'd held her hand as the consumption stole her breath. The last words her mother had whispered, "Be free, my darling. Whatever it costs, be free." Jeremiah told her about finding Sarah Brennan in Miller's Pass, how the girl had smiled at him despite her injuries, had thanked him for trying, how she'd asked him to tell her parents she loved them before the fever took her, how he'd kept that promise, then fled to the mountains to escape their grateful tears. "We're a pair, aren't we?" Eleanor said with dark humor. The branded woman and the hermit. Like something from a penny dreadful. Those usually have happier endings. Jeremiah observed. Maybe this one will too. They fell quiet as the fire burned low. The intimacy of the moment, the cave, the stories, the shared warmth, created a bubble separate from the harsh world outside. Eleanor became acutely aware of every point where their bodies touched, not with fear or revulsion, but with something new, something that had been growing between them through all the trials and dangers. "Jeremiah," she began, then stopped, uncertain how to voice what she felt. He turned to her, and in his gray eyes she saw her own confusion reflected. The attraction was there, had been building for days, but so were the complications. Her recent trauma, their different worlds, the uncertain future that awaited in Silver Creek. "I know," he said simply. "Feel it too, but you've been through enough. Don't need me adding to it." "What if you're not adding to it?" Eleanor asked. "What if you're healing it?" She lifted her hand to his face, tracing the line of his jaw. He caught her hand gently, his thumb brushing over the brand on her wrist. "This doesn't define you," he said. "But it's still fresh, the hurt of it, inside and out. You need time to figure out who Eleanor is when she's not running, not surviving, just living." Eleanor knew he was right, but it didn't ease the ache of wanting. After so much taking, she yearned to give. After so much violence, she craved tenderness. "Will you just hold me? Nothing more. Just hold me like I'm not broken." Without hesitation, he drew her into his arms. Eleanor curled against his chest, listening to his heartbeat, feeling truly safe for the first time in months. His hand stroked her hair gently, and she felt tears slip down her cheeks, not of sadness, but of release. "You're not broken," he murmured against her hair. "Bent, maybe, tested surely, but not broken. Strongest woman I've ever known." They stayed like that as the fire died to embers and snow continued to fall outside their shelter. Eleanor dozed, waking periodically to assure herself this was real, the warmth, the safety. the connection that asked nothing but gave everything. Near dawn. She stirred to find Jeremiah adding wood to the fire. The storm had passed, leaving crystalline silence in its wake. Through the cave mouth, she could see the first pale light touching the peaks. "Last day," she said, unable to keep the sadness from her voice. "To Silver Creek." "Yes." He paused in his movements. "Been thinking, there's trapping opportunities near the mining camps. Man could make a living if he didn't mind some company now and then." Hope bloomed in Eleanor's chest. "You'd do that, leave your mountain. Mountains will be there. But this," he gestured between them, "this is rarer than gold. Worth changing for. Maybe. I can't ask you to." "You're not asking, I'm offering." He met her gaze steadily. "Not saying it would be easy. You need time to heal, to find your feet. And I need to remember how to be around people. But maybe we could figure it out together, if you're willing." Eleanor thought about it seriously. The attraction was real, but so were the challenges. She was fleeing one man's control. She couldn't risk falling into another's, no matter how gentle. "As equals," she said firmly. "Not as savior and saved, not as protector and protected. As equals. Only way worth doing it." He agreed. They broke their fast with the last of their supplies, a handful of dried berries and melted snow. Then they prepared for the final descent. Eleanor checked her knife, her rescued map, the few possessions that had survived the journey. So little to show for a life. Yet she felt richer than she had in years. As they prepared to leave the cave, Jeremiah stopped her. "Want you to know something. Whatever happens down there, whether you choose to have me stay or not, I'm glad. Glad I found you. Glad we made this journey. You gave me a reason to rejoin the world. That's a debt I can't repay." "You saved my life," Eleanor protested. "And you saved mine," he countered, just in a different way. They emerged from the cave into a world transformed by snow and morning light. The peaks glowed rose and gold, and below, Silver Creek's smoke plumes rose straight in the still air. It looked almost welcoming, this rough mining town that would be Eleanor's new beginning. As they began the final descent, Eleanor reached for Jeremiah's hand, not from need, but from choice. He squeezed gently, and together they walked toward the future, uncertain but unafraid. "No looking back," Eleanor said, as much to herself as to him. "Only forward," he agreed. Behind them, the cave that had sheltered their most intimate conversation disappeared into the landscape. But what had been shared there, the stories, the understanding, the first fragile bonds of something that might become love, those traveled with them. Eleanor touched the brand on her wrist one last time, then pulled her sleeve down to cover it. It would always be there, a reminder of what she'd survived. But it no longer had power over her. She had found something stronger than ownership, deeper than possession. She had found connection, trust, the possibility of love based on choice rather than control. The mining camp grew larger with each step, and Eleanor felt no fear. Whatever challenges awaited, she would meet them as herself, not as property, not as victim, but as a woman who had walked through fire and ice to claim her freedom. Beside her, Jeremiah walked steady and sure, a man stepping out of his self-imposed exile into an uncertain but hopeful future. They had saved each other in ways neither had expected when this journey began. And now, with Silver Creek's rough buildings taking shape before them, their real journey could begin. Not the flight from danger, but the slower, harder, more rewarding path of two damaged souls learning to trust, to heal, and perhaps, given time and patience and courage, to love. The sun climbed higher, warming their faces and lighting their way. Behind them, their footprints in the snow told the story of where they'd been. Ahead, unmarked snow awaited their next steps. Eleanor smiled, truly smiled. For the first time in months, she was free. They were free. And that, more than any promise or plan, was enough for now. Silver Creek had sheltered them for 3 months. In that time, Eleanor had found work at the boarding house, serving meals to miners and keeping the accounts. Jeremiah had established himself as a hunter, supplying fresh game to the camps. They had built separate lives while carefully nurturing the connection between them. Sunday walks, shared dinners, quiet conversations that lasted until the stars faded. But as spring warmed the mountain passes, they both felt the pull of unfinished business. Eleanor stood at the window of her small room above the boarding house, watching the road that led back toward Cedar Ridge. The snow was melting, revealing the path she'd fled along in desperate terror months before. "You're thinking about going back," Jeremiah said from the doorway. He had a way of reading her thoughts that should have been unsettling, but felt instead like understanding. "I can't hide forever," Eleanor replied, "and neither can he be allowed to do to another woman what he did to me." Jeremiah entered the room, standing beside her at the window. "It's dangerous. He has money, influence. The law tends to side with men like him." "I know, but I have something now I didn't have then." She turned to face him. "I have proof. I have my voice. And I have you. If you'll come with me." "You know I will." They had discussed it carefully over the past weeks as reports filtered in from travelers. Blackwood had put out word that his wife had been kidnapped by a mountain man, that a reward awaited anyone who returned her. But there were whispers too. Servants who had fled. Ranch hands who spoke in hushed tones about what they'd seen. The branded woman wasn't the first to bear his cruelty, just the first to escape and survive. Eleanor packed her few possessions, including the dress she'd worn the night she fled, torn and blood-stained but preserved as evidence. She had also gathered testimonies from other women in Silver Creek, some who had their own stories of powerful men and the marks they left. There was strength in numbers, in shared truth. The journey back took 4 days. The landscape that had been an enemy in winter showed a different face in spring. Wildflowers pushing through remaining snow, streams running full with melt, eagles circling in clear blue skies. Eleanor rode her own horse now, purchased with her earnings, side by side with Jeremiah rather than following in his footsteps. As they descended toward Cedar Ridge, Eleanor felt her courage falter. The familiar shapes of buildings, the dusty Main Street, the distant sprawl of Blackwood Ranch, all of it brought back the terror and humiliation. Her hand went unconsciously to her wrist. "We can still turn back," Jeremiah offered quietly. "No." Eleanor straightened in her saddle. "I ran away as property. I return as a person. There's a difference." They rode directly to the small church at the town's edge. Reverend Michael Walsh was a young man, newly arrived from the East with idealistic notions about bringing civilization to the frontier. Eleanor had gambled that his idealism hadn't yet been crushed by frontier realities. The Reverend listened to their story in his simple office, his face growing paler as Eleanor showed him the brand, the scars, the evidence of systematic abuse. "This is horrific," he stammered. "But Mr. Blackwood is a pillar of the community. He contributes generously to the church." "Blood money," Eleanor said flatly. "Will you help us or not?" To his credit, the Reverend wrestled with his conscience only briefly. "There's a circuit judge due next week, Judge Harrison. He's known to be fair, not easily swayed by local politics. If we can gather enough witnesses." Word spread quickly through Cedar Ridge. Eleanor Blackwood had returned. Some said she came back wild-eyed and mad. Others whispered she had a mountain man with her who'd kill anyone who looked at her wrong. But beneath the gossip ran a current of something else, anticipation, perhaps even hope. They took rooms at the hotel, separate but adjoining, that first night. Eleanor sat by her window watching the ranch in the distance, lights burning in the main house. She wondered if Blackwood knew she was here, if he was planning his response. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. She opened the connecting door to find Jeremiah holding 2 cups of coffee. "Figured you might not be sleeping much." They sat together in companionable silence, drawing strength from each other's presence. "Are you ready for this?" he asked eventually. "I've been ready since the night he branded me." Eleanor replied, "I just didn't know it then." The next days brought a stream of unexpected visitors. Maria, the housekeeper from the ranch, Arrived at dawn with 2 other women from the Mexican workers' quarters. Through tears, they told their own stories, years of abuse they'd endured in silence, afraid of deportation or worse if they spoke up. Then came Jake Morrison, the stable hand who had looked the other way when Eleanor fled. "Been waiting for someone to stand up to him," he said gruffly. "Man's got a lot to answer for." Even Elizabeth Garrett, the banker's wife and pillar of Cedar Ridge society, came calling, behind closed doors. She revealed why she'd always avoided Blackwood's social invitations, why she'd warned her daughters to never be alone with him. But it was the arrival of Anna Blackwood that shocked everyone. Samuel's first wife's sister had traveled from Denver when she heard the news. "My sister didn't die of fever," she said quietly in the Reverend's office. "She died of injuries, internal injuries. The doctor was paid well to keep quiet, but I knew. I've known for 7 years and said nothing, to my eternal shame." By the time Judge Harrison arrived, they had a dozen witnesses ready to testify. The judge, a stern man in his 60s with piercing blue eyes, set up court in the town hall. What was meant to be a simple hearing became the event of the year, with people crowding in from miles around. Samuel Blackwood arrived with 3 lawyers from Denver, his face a mask of controlled rage. He'd dressed carefully, the respectable rancher, the wronged husband. His eyes found Eleanor across the courtroom, promising retribution. Eleanor met his gaze steadily. She was no longer the terrified girl he'd brutalized. Beside her, Jeremiah sat quiet but alert, his presence a reminder that she was not alone this time. "This is a serious matter," Judge Harrison began. "Accusations of assault, unlawful confinement, and grievous bodily harm. Mr. Blackwood, how do you answer?" "My wife is clearly disturbed," Blackwood said smoothly. "She ran off with this mountain person. Now she concocts wild tales to justify her adultery and abandonment." The judge turned to Eleanor. "Mrs. Blackwood, are you prepared to present your case?" Eleanor stood, her voice clear and steady. "I am not Mrs. Blackwood. That was a name forced upon me along with other violations. I am Eleanor Whitfield, and I am here to tell the truth." She began with her arrival in Cedar Ridge, the hopeful bride trying to save her family. She spoke of the escalating control, the violence, the night of the branding, when she revealed the scar, showing it to the packed courtroom. Several women gasped. Men shifted uncomfortably. One by one, the other witnesses testified. Maria spoke through a translator about years of abuse. Anna Blackwood presented letters her sister had hidden, documenting injuries. Jake Morrison described the climate of fear at the ranch. Even Reverend Walsh testified about parishioners who had come to him with concerns they'd been too frightened to make official. Blackwood's lawyers fought viciously, questioning every witness's credibility, suggesting conspiracy and bribery. But the evidence was overwhelming, and Judge Harrison was not a man easily fooled. "Mr. Hunt," the judge addressed Jeremiah, "you're accused of kidnapping Miss Whitfield. What say you?" Jeremiah stood slowly. "I found a woman near death in a canyon. I gave her shelter and safe passage. If that's kidnapping, then I'm guilty. But I'd do it again." "And your relationship with Miss Whitfield now?" "She's the bravest person I know," Jeremiah said simply. "And when this is over, if she'll have me, I intend to court her proper, as equals, as she deserves." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at his public declaration. Across the room, Blackwood's face had gone purple with rage. The judge deliberated for only an hour. When he returned, his expression was grave. "Mr. Blackwood, I find substantial evidence of assault and unlawful treatment. This matter will be referred to territorial authorities for criminal prosecution. In the meantime, you are ordered to have no contact with Miss Whitfield." Furthermore, the judge continued, "the marriage is hereby dissolved on grounds of cruelty and abuse. All claims Mr. Blackwood might have on Miss Whitfield's person or property are void." The courtroom erupted. Blackwood shot to his feet, shouting threats until the sheriff's deputies restrained him. Women wept openly. Men who'd worked under Blackwood's cruel hand nodded satisfaction. Eleanor felt Jeremiah's hand find hers, anchoring her as the magnitude of the moment washed over her. She was free, legally, officially, publicly free. Outside the courthouse, people pressed around them, women offering thanks for her courage, men tipping their hats with newfound respect. Through the crowd, Eleanor saw Maria smiling through tears, Jake Morrison grinning broadly, Anna Blackwood nodding with sad satisfaction. "What now?" Jeremiah asked as they finally found a quiet moment. Eleanor looked out over the town where her nightmare had begun and her freedom had been won. The sun was setting, painting the mountains gold, the same mountains that had tested them and sheltered them and brought them together. "Now we live," she said. "Not in hiding, not in fear, just live." Together, she turned to him, this man who had saved her body and helped her save her soul. "If you're still willing to court a notorious woman, only one I'd consider," he replied with one of his rare smiles. They walked together down Main Street, no longer fugitives but free citizens. Behind them, the courthouse stood as a monument to justice served. Ahead, the mountains rose eternal, holding both bitter memories and sweet ones. Eleanor touched the brand on her wrist one last time. It would always be there, a reminder of what she'd survived, but it no longer defined her. She had broken free, found her voice, and claimed her justice. The scared girl who'd arrived in Cedar Ridge was gone, replaced by a woman who knew her own strength. And beside her walked a man who saw that strength and honored it, who offered partnership instead of possession. Together, they headed toward a future written by their own hands, branded by nothing but the choices they freely made. The stars were beginning to appear as they reached the edge of town, brilliant in the clear mountain air. Eleanor breathed deeply, tasting freedom on the wind. She was no longer bound, no longer branded in any way that mattered. She was simply, gloriously, completely free. The morning sun painted Cedar Ridge in shades of gold and promise. 6 months had passed since the trial, and the town had slowly adjusted to its new reality. Samuel Blackwood sat in territorial prison awaiting further hearings, his ranch under management by court-appointed trustees. The empire built on cruelty had crumbled, and from its ashes, something new was growing. Eleanor stood before the old Blackwood ranch house, now transformed into a shelter for women fleeing dangerous situations. The irony wasn't lost on her. The place where she'd been branded now bore a sign reading, "Haven House, a sanctuary for new beginnings." Maria had agreed to manage it, her gentle strength perfect for helping other wounded souls. "You sure about this?" Jeremiah asked, standing beside her. He'd traded his mountain leathers for simpler town clothes, though he still moved with the quiet grace of a man who knew wild places. "The land shouldn't suffer for what happened here," Eleanor replied. "And those women need somewhere safe to go, somewhere they can heal and decide their own futures." They had used the settlement from the divorce, every penny Blackwood had been forced to pay, to establish the shelter. The grand house that had been her prison now offered freedom to others. Where violence had reigned, compassion took root. Inside, they found Anna Blackwood directing volunteers and setting up bedrooms. She had moved from Denver to help run the shelter, finding purpose in honoring her sister's memory. "Eleanor," she called out, "come see what we've done with the study." The room where Eleanor had been branded was now a library and teaching space. Books lined the walls, donated from across the territory. A desk stood where Blackwood's had been, but this one held paper and pens for women learning to write their own stories. "We're starting literacy classes next week," Anna explained. "Mrs. Garrett has volunteered to teach, and several of the Mexican women want to learn English." Eleanor touched the desk, remembering another desk, another night, but the memory had lost its power to wound. "It's perfect," she said softly. They spent the morning helping with preparations. More women had already inquired about shelter. Word traveled fast among the vulnerable. Each story was different, yet achingly familiar. Violence wore many faces but left similar scars. As noon approached, Jeremiah touched Eleanor's elbow. "Ready?" Today was more than just the shelter's opening. Today, Eleanor would stand before the community and tell her whole story, not in court this time, but as testimony to survival and hope. The idea terrified her more than facing Blackwood had. The church was packed. It seemed all of Cedar Ridge had come, along with folks from neighboring towns. Eleanor saw familiar faces, Jake Morrison with his family, the Mexican women who had testified, even some of Blackwood's former cowboys who'd found better employment elsewhere. Reverend Walsh introduced her simply, "Miss Eleanor Whitfield has asked to address us about her journey and the work of Haven House. I ask you to listen with open hearts." Eleanor stood at the pulpit, her hands steady despite her racing heart. In the front row, Jeremiah gave her an encouraging nod. She began to speak. "2 years ago, I came to Cedar Ridge as a bride. I left it as a fugitive. Today, I stand before you as myself, neither role defining me, both having shaped me." She told it all, the desperation that had driven her west, the slow revelation of Blackwood's nature, the night of the branding. She showed her scar to the congregation, no longer hiding it. "He meant this to mark me as property. Instead, it reminds me that I survived, that I chose freedom over safety, truth over silence." She spoke of the flight through the mountains, though she kept some details private, the cave's intimacy, the moments of connection that belonged only to her and Jeremiah. She told of the kindness of strangers in Silver Creek, the courage of witnesses who risked their own safety to testify. "But mostly," Eleanor said, "I want to speak of what comes after the escape, after the trial, after the headlines fade. The healing isn't dramatic. It's small moments, learning to sleep without nightmares, to trust a gentle touch, to believe you deserve kindness. It's slow work, patient work, sacred work." She looked out over the packed church, seeing tears on many faces, recognition in too many eyes. Haven House is for that work, for women who need time and space and safety to remember who they were before the violence, or to discover who they can become after it. Your support, financial, yes, but also emotional, makes this possible. When she finished, the silence was profound. Then Jake Morrison stood and began to clap. Others joined him, rising to their feet, until the entire congregation stood in ovation. Eleanor felt tears slip down her cheeks, not of pain this time, but of belonging. This town that had witnessed her degradation now celebrated her resurrection. After the service, people pressed forward, women sharing their own stories, men offering to help with repairs at Haven House, donations pressed into her hands. Through it all, Jeremiah stayed close, his quiet presence a reminder that she wasn't alone. As the crowd finally thinned, an elderly woman approached. Eleanor recognized her as Mother Sullivan, the town's unofficial matriarch. "Took courage, what you did today," she said, "both the telling and the forgiving." "Forgiving?" Eleanor was puzzled. "This town failed you," Mother Sullivan said bluntly. "We saw the signs and did nothing. Too afraid, too comfortable. You could have burned us down with your words today. Instead, you offered us redemption. That's a gift, child. Don't let anyone tell you different." As they walked back to Haven House for the official opening, Eleanor pondered those words. She hadn't thought of it as forgiveness. She'd simply focused on moving forward. But perhaps that's what forgiveness was. Not forgetting, not excusing, but choosing to build rather than burn. The opening ceremony was simple but moving. Maria cut the ribbon with scissors that had once been used to cut her hair in penance for imagined sins. "Now they open doors," she said in her improving English, and everyone understood the symbolism. The first official resident had already arrived, a young woman from a ranch 50 miles away, bearing bruises Eleanor recognized too well. As Maria led her inside, Eleanor saw herself 2 years ago, frightened, desperate, but taking the first step toward freedom. As the sun set, Eleanor and Jeremiah found themselves alone on the porch where she'd once stood in terror. Now it felt like any other porch, wooden boards and rails, nothing more sinister than a place to watch sunsets. "You did a powerful thing today," Jeremiah said quietly. "We did," Eleanor corrected. "None of this happens without you." He smiled. He did that more often now. She'd noticed, "Been thinking," he said. "The shelter's established, the work's begun. Maybe it's time we talked about what comes next. For us." Eleanor's heart quickened. They'd been courting properly for months, taking their time, letting trust build alongside attraction. But she'd been waiting for this conversation, hoping for it. "What did you have in mind?" she asked, trying to sound casual. From his pocket, Jeremiah drew out a small wooden box. Inside lay a ring, not fancy, but beautiful in its simplicity. A small turquoise stone set in silver, like the sky caught in metal. "Figured we've done things backward from the start," he said. "You fled a marriage to find freedom. Seems only right you should choose marriage from freedom this time." Eleanor looked from the ring to his face. Seeing the vulnerability there, this man who'd lived alone for 8 years was offering to bind his life to hers. Not as owner to property, but as equal to equal. "You know I come with complications," she said softly. "The shelter, the work, the history that will always follow me. You know I come with my own ghosts," he replied. "Maybe that's why we fit. We both know what loss feels like, what survival costs, makes what we're building together more precious." Eleanor took the ring, holding it up to catch the last light of day. It was perfect, unique, strong, beautiful without ostentation, like the man offering it, like what they'd built together. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes to all of it, to you, to us, to whatever comes next." He slipped the ring onto her finger, the same hand that bore Blackwood's brand. The contrast was profound. One mark forced in violence, the other chosen in love. Both would be part of her story, but only one would define her future. They were married a month later in a simple ceremony at Haven House. Maria stood as Eleanor's witness, Jake Morrison as Jeremiah's. The shelter's residents decorated the main room with wildflowers, and Anna Blackwood played piano. Reverend Walsh performed the ceremony, his words carefully chosen to honor new beginnings rather than traditional bindings. "Do you, Eleanor, choose this man of your own free will?" he asked, understanding the weight of those words for her. "I do," Eleanor said firmly, looking into Jeremiah's gray eyes. Freely and gladly. The celebration afterward was joyful and healing. Women who'd known only violence in marriage witnessed one built on respect. Men who'd thought strength meant dominance saw it in gentleness. The town that had failed Eleanor once now surrounded her with support. As the evening wound down, Eleanor stood with Jeremiah on the same porch where she'd accepted his proposal. The mountains rose in the distance, eternal and unchanging, but she saw them differently now. Not as barriers or refuges, but simply as beautiful parts of a landscape she'd claimed as home. "No regrets?" Jeremiah asked, his arm around her waist. Eleanor touched the brand on her wrist, then the ring on her finger. "None," she said. "Every step led here, even the painful ones." The stars emerged one by one in the clear sky, and Eleanor breathed deeply of the mountain air. She had been bound and branded, had fled to the hills with a silent hunter, had found her voice and her strength and her freedom. The journey had been harrowing, but it had brought her here, to this porch, this man, this life she'd chosen for herself. In the house behind them, women slept safely for perhaps the first time in years. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new stories of pain seeking healing. But tonight, Eleanor stood with her chosen partner and looked out at a future bright with possibility. She had broken free when a silent hunter took her to the hills. But more than that, she had returned to build something from the ashes of her suffering. Haven House would be her legacy, proof that brands could be transformed from marks of ownership into symbols of survival. "Ready to go in?" Jeremiah asked. Eleanor took his hand, scarred like hers, gentle despite its strength. "Ready," she said. Together, they walked into their future. Two souls who had found each other in the wilderness and chosen to make their stand in the very place where the story began. It was, Eleanor thought, the perfect ending, or rather, the perfect beginning. Thank you for listening to this story of courage, survival, and ultimately, love and redemption in the Wild West. Where are you listening from today? Please share in the comments below. I'd love to connect with listeners from around the world. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel and share your thoughts about Eleanor and Jeremiah's journey. Your comments help bring this community together.